This is the second part of Lecture 2, the second of our video lectures, and I'm going through a series of 7 concepts which I referred to as the nation of Israel and the purposes of God, Part 2. And in the first half of the first part of this, we'll be quicker in this one. The first part of this lecture, Lecture 2, I went through the first 4. I'm going to review them very, very quickly. And again, what we're doing here is trying to, the lecture is designed to bring us face to face with some of the elements of what the Bible teaches about specifically what God is doing through Israel in the Old Testament. And there are elements of God's purposes which are plain in the scriptures, but rather at least unfamiliar, almost counterintuitive to us as believers in the New Covenant era. And so we've got to rather carefully recalibrate. That's what I ask you to do. Recalibrate your heads. And all of this is so germane to what we're going to be talking about in Israel that I really want us to get this as sort of a broad construct within which to think about the scriptures. So very quickly, concept 1 has to do with God's purposes for Israel, for raising up Israel. We said that you are well over halfway through Old Testament history. God has been dealing with the nations of the world as a race. But in Genesis 12, about 2,100 years before Jesus, before Christ, God takes a remarkable turn in the corner and chooses one man and determines to make a covenant with him and to work with him and his offspring, his generations. And why? Well, the point is that all of that, Abraham and his children, are God's way to put himself on display to the world. He's not neglecting the world. In order to do that, he places Israel providentially, the land, in the most strategic spot where all the nations of the world, the caravans and the army and so on, are going to be funneled into that land, specifically into and then out of through Mount Carmel, the Jezreel Valley. But the fact is that they're going to hear about what God, Yahweh, King Yahweh, is doing on behalf of his people, and those tales, those stories, those revelatory stories. Remember that revelation always comes in 2 stages. And first of all, there is event revelation, where God breaks in and perpendicularizes himself to human history. And the revelation is in the event. And so it always begins with event revelation and then word revelation, as God raises up spokesmen, prophets in the Old Testament, apostles in the New, and they record those revelatory events and then they interpret them for us. So God's revelation of himself to mankind begins where he intervenes, where he, I like to say, perpendicularizes himself to human history and breaks in, and you have these mighty acts of God, these miraculous acts which are in themselves revelatory. And the fact is that those stories are going to be heard, and they're going to be retold and so on and carried about the world because of Israel's strategic place geographically among the nations. But then Israel itself, the little land, though tiny, is divided into these distinct divisions so that Israel could live up into the mountaintops and in remarkable security and privacy, even though the traffic of the world is passing through on both sides. And thus they could be a holy nation. I want to say it once again. This has to do other elements as well, but Israel, remember Exodus 19 and verse 6, Israel is to be a kingdom with a priestly function. But beyond that, they are to be a holy nation, set apart, distinct. And to that end, you have these remarkable divisions. And then we said that God gave Israel this marvelous law system which would distinguish them among the nations, and other nations would stand in awe of the wisdom and the understanding of Israel as reflected in her in that Mosaic law system. All right, so those are the first 4, and I'm going to go a little different direction but build on those as well. So the 5th is this, and this is really important. It's geography. It's a little bit pedantic, if you don't mind. There will be a full load of pedantry on this trip, but it's important pedantry. And so I call it regular rainfall, rapid runoff, and God's requirement of righteousness. The concept is really well expressed here in Deuteronomy chapter 11, where God says to Israel that the land into which you are going, and again, this is Moses as he is about to die, and that is, he's on the plains of Moab, and he's brought the nation of Israel out. He's brought the family of Abraham to Mount Sinai and crafted them in God's purposes to the nation of Israel under King Yahweh. And now at the plains of Moab, as he's about to die and turn the mantle over to Joshua, Moses preaches Deuteronomy, and in the course of that, he says this, and this is marvelously descriptive. I'm here in Deuteronomy 11, verse 10. God says the land, now he's speaking to this generation. By the way, this is a believing generation. The old generation is dead. They've spent 38 years bumping into things. You know, we talk about the wilderness wanderings. They really weren't bumping into things. They were burying their dead. That old generation that left Egypt, that followed the cloud, but they didn't want to. They would have stayed behind, and every opportunity they had, they expressed their disbelief and their anger, I think, at leaving. They loved all things Egyptian, including Egyptian gods. But that generation is dead. Everybody 20 years of age and older on the night they crossed the Red Sea has died, save Joshua and Caleb. And now this new generation is on the border of the promised land, and they're anxious to follow Joshua into the land. But Moses says to them, the land which you go to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and watered it by foot as a vegetable garden. Now, guess what he's saying? He's saying, with the land you were in for the last 400 years, and all that you people have known, no, that's not, back up. What Israel had known as a people for 400 years. This new generation, most of them were born in the course of the wilderness wanderings, those 40 years or so. But the point is, God says, the land from which you came is a land that is heralded all over the world, is fabled all over the world. They have this Nile River, and it overfloods its banks every year. And when those floodwaters recede, it leaves behind thick layers of tillable soil, fresh, nutrient-rich soil. So there, you could have a garden anywhere. You can just walk down, fill the bucket, you could have a garden. The land you're going to is not like that. Now he goes on to say in verse 11, the land which you go over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of heaven. Now, this is such a delightful description. The land you go to possess is a land of steep hills and deep valleys. And when the rains come, and there is ample rain, Israel, in the large part, gets plenty of rain. But it comes in buckets, and it runs off, and it's hard to trap. So he says, the land which you are going to is not like Egypt. It's a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of heaven. And listen to this, a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So the point is that Israel could never count on next year's rain and thus next year's harvest. I tell people all the time, wherever you are in the Bible, consciously factor into your head this reality, that those people lived from harvest to harvest. You could never count on next year's harvest. And that was especially meaningful in Israel because you couldn't hold on to the water. You got plenty of it, but it ran off. And thus you were dependent. Now, in point of fact, there are two distinct seasons of the year. I'm going to come back to that. Maybe I should go back and just say this, that what is at issue here is that, and I'm going to read that verse again, verse 12. This is a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning of the year to the very end of the year. Now, what he means by that is this is a land which is desperately dependent upon the annual cycle of rain. And therefore, you can't just count on the overflowing Nile. You need the rain, and only God can give you the rain. So you're going into a land where if you're going to survive, you're going to have a grain. In order to have grain, you got to have rain. If you're going to have rain, God's going to have to send it. He has to watch over it. Now, to expand on that very quickly, and this is a very important concept, we'll mention it again in the land. We'll talk about it again and again. Get it. It's quite simple. There are two distinct seasons of the year in Israel. And by the way, they represent two different growing seasons. That is, well, as I say here, they're in the winter, which is basically October, November through March, April, as I say. You have in the winter is when you grow grain. Now, that is you plant grain in the fall and you harvest it in the spring and summer. So the winter is the rainy season. It's when you grow your field crops, your grain crops, all sorts of field crops. And in order for that to happen, you are totally dependent upon an early rain or a former rain, which comes again in October, November, somewhere, sometimes a little earlier, but usually in October. Because you see, here's the thing. For 6 months of the year, matter of fact, I should say this. I'm going to be crude here, but here's the Mediterranean, here's little Israel, and here's the Arabian Desert. And of course, this is the Mediterranean Sea. And for 6 months of the year, the summer months, all the weather comes to the Arabian Desert from the east. That's why in the Bible, again and again, an east wind is used as a word picture for miserable situation. If there's an east wind blowing in your life, it's a miserable thing because you're not going to get any water. It's a hot, dry, torturous wind. So all the weather comes off the Arabian Desert in the summer. In the winter, all the weather comes off the Mediterranean Sea, so it's moist. So during the winter rainy season, you're growing your grain crops, you're dependent upon those rains and so on. During the summer, you get no rain, but during the summer, the sun beats hot and it bakes the earth. And so as the grain season, as the farming season approaches, you are desperately dependent upon these former rains. Because these former rains, and what happens is this, and I don't understand everything about it by any means, but it's a climatological phenomenon. But what happens is that there is a huge shift in the frontal systems over Israel. And this frontal shift produces a season of quite, I wouldn't say violent, but a lot of weather activity, and it includes a dumping of rain. And those rains are necessary, and it's called the former rains, comes at the beginning of the grain growing season, somewhere around October, November. And those former rains, or early rains as they're called, are necessary just to break up the earth so you can get a plow in the ground and plant your seed. So you've had this long, hot summer. You're waiting patiently but impatiently for the coming of the former rains. And when the former rains come, you get out, you loosen up the soil, you get your grain in, and then all through the winter, you're praying for regular rain, because in the spring, there comes a latter rain. The latter rains, and again, they come sometime in March, April, and that signals the transition from the winter rainy season to the summer dry season. But those latter rains are necessary. The growing season is short, and you need them to set the crops and so on. And once those latter rains are behind you, and they may space out over a couple of weeks, but once they're gone, now you're into the summer, you get no more rain. So you get into the fields and you take your crops before they burn out. So again, two distinct seasons. One is the winter rainy season from October, November through March, April, but you are dependent upon the latter rains. The former rains, folks. In antiquity, and it's just because the cycle of life, the year tended to begin when the earth would green up. So in the summer, it's very brown in this part of the world, but now as the rains come, it begins. So the former rains come early in the year which begins in the fall, and those former rains are necessary to break up the soil. Then the latter rains come in the spring, early summer, and they are necessary to set the crop and so on. So in the winter, you're growing your grain, harvesting them in the springtime, and even into the summer. On the other hand, the second season of the year is the summer dry season. I already talked about it. You get no rain because all the weather is coming off the Arabian Desert. But on the other hand, get this. Israel lies between the desert, the Arabian Desert to the east, and the sea, the Mediterranean Sea to the west. In the summer, you get the sun beating on the earth all day long, and here's the sea. And the air begins to heat, and then the air begins to rise. And when that happens, you get these moist displacement winds, and it really is to die for. You won't experience it in December, but in the heat of the spring and the summer, you really appreciate those afternoon winds. But those winds coming off the Mediterranean. Now, the weather is coming from the east, but the displacement winds come late in the day from the Mediterranean, and when that happens, they're moist. So you get a heavy dew in the summer, and about 75% of the time in the summer, about 75% of the land reaches dew point. And so that dew, and this is the point, that dew, that heavy moisture that settles down in the evening, is sufficient to grow vineyard and orchard crops. Now, I like to refer to these as the what did I do here? Hold on here. I tried to do something. Yeah. All right. Here, in the summer season, you grow vineyard and orchard. These are grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and so on. I like to refer to these as the hillside crops. Now, remember that we talked about these steep hills that characterize so much of Israel, and they're terraced hills. They're not even hills. But what Israel, because of the limestone and the upthrust, Israel would enhance those terraces. That is, they'd build a wall on the edge of a terrace, wait for the soil to wash down, and then they would plant on those hillsides. And so the hillside crops, and we'll see much of this, are, as I say, grapes and figs and pomegranates and olives, and they thrive on the dew. So watch this. Two distinct, I'm going to say it again, growing seasons. There is, first of all, the winter rainy season when you grow your grain, and you plant that in the fall after the former rains, and then you harvest it in the springtime in connection with the latter rains. But all summer long, then, you are working at pruning and caring for the hillside crops, grapes, figs, and so on, and those are harvested in the fall. So there are two growing seasons: winter green season, summer hillside crops, and two harvest seasons. In the spring and summer, you're harvesting your grain crops, and in the fall, after the summer hot season, when you grow those hillside crops, then you are harvesting your hillside crops. Now, the significance is that now I'm going to go back to Deuteronomy 11, because let me read it to you again. I'm going to read the whole thing. Forgive me here, but Deuteronomy 11, I can barely see, but I think I can. Deuteronomy 11, I'll start in verse 10. The land which you go to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and watered it by foot as a vegetable garden. But the land which you go over to possess is a land of hills and valleys the land drinks water from the rains of heaven. And thus it is a land for which the Lord your God, the idea is, must care. The eyes of the Lord your God must be always on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Now listen to this. And it shall be that if you earnestly obey my commandments, which I command you today, to love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart, then I will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, your new wine, and your oil, both your winter and your summer crops. And I will send grain in your fields for your livestock and so on. But take heed to yourselves, lest your heart be deceived and you turn aside from me. And when the Lord's anger is aroused against you, he will shut up the heavens so that there be no rain, and the land yields no produce, and you perish quickly from the good land which the Lord has given you. So the point is, I like to say that what's at stake here, there is regular rainfall. You can count, there will be plenty of rain, almost always. The problem is there is rapid runoff, and therefore you are dependent. God must watch over this, and God's requirement is that you be righteous, and if so, you will have the former and the latter rains. But if you refuse to obey God, then he'll not. So I think it's just very, very instructive that God, in fact, he put Israel in a land which provided him with, if you don't mind, a rather easy means of getting their attention. They kind of put a leash around their neck, and he could give it a jerk very, very easily. So let's put it all together. God intended for Israel to be a light to the nations, and so he placed the nation, the land of Israel, in such a place where the nations are going to be funneled into it and hear about it. But he built the land in such a way that you have these divisions, and they could live unto themselves. They could be not only a kingdom with a priestly function, but a set-apart nation. And then he gave them this remarkable system of law, which described not only their worship but their walk, and would make an impression that the rest of the world would say, what nation is there that had a God so near and a law so wise? But then he also framed the climate in such a way that if they disobeyed, God could very easily and very effectively get their attention by withholding the former and latter rain. And then the sixth, very closely related to that concept, is what I call the cycle of calendar, climate, crops, and celebrations. Now, what I'm talking about here is the cycle of Levitical feasts. This is Leviticus chapter 23. He lays them out most carefully. And quite simply, there were 7 feasts each year. And at every one of these feasts, the entire land of Israel, the culture en masse, was required to pretty much stop what they were doing and focus on what God wanted them to focus on. But I want you to notice that these 7 feasts are actually grouped in 3 feast seasons. Very simply, in the fall, in the spring, there is the Passover cycle. But it also includes unleavened bread and first fruits. I'm going to come to this in just a minute. I just want you to see it. Then in the summer, in the early summer, there was a standalone feast. It was all by itself, called Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot as we know it. And then in the fall, can you see any of this? There was the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, those 3 feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, are what are referred to as the 3 pilgrimage feasts, because Yahweh, King Yahweh, had commanded in his giving of the law. Remember, Leviticus is God, King Yahweh, giving the law as to how Israel as a people was to conduct themselves. And he had laid out that on these 3 seasons, every male adult Jew was to attend, was to appear, excuse me, at the central altar, Shiloh, for 300 years, and then Jerusalem after Solomon. But every male adult Jew was to appear there and basically swear allegiance to King Yahweh. So you have these 3 pilgrimage, because you had to make a pilgrimage to the central sanctuary. Passover in the spring, Pentecost in the summer, and Tabernacles in the fall. But there were actually 7 feasts, because with Tabernacles went the Day of Atonement and, well, I should put it the other way, the Feast of Trumpets. So there are 7 feasts, but they are in 3 seasons. In the spring, you had the Passover, which also included unleavened bread and first fruits. Then Pentecost in the summer stood alone. And then in the fall, you had Tabernacles, which was actually preceded, first of all, by trumpets, and then the Day of Atonement. So you had 7 distinct feasts gathered in clusters of 3 feasts, 1 feast, and 3 feasts. All right, so let me talk about those. Here it is. And my point here is simply that there are several elements of the law which were designed to build into the life of Israel a very deliberate rhythm. So you had the weekly Sabbath and the cycle of Sabbaths and so on. But most important, perhaps, was the annual cycle of 3 pilgrimage feasts. And here they are. Passover, I just talked about it. Pentecost, 50 days after Passover Sabbath came Pentecost. Penta is 50. In Hebrew, it's called Shavuot, which is the plural of Sabbath, which means 7s, because it was 7 weeks, 7 times 7, and then the next the first day of the next week. And so you had 49 days and then the 50th day. And that's why we call it Pentecost, 50th, but it really in the Bible is the Feast of Weeks, 7 sevens. So you had Passover in the spring, Pentecost in the summer, and tabernacles or booths. Tabernacles, I got to tell you right now, has nothing to do with the tabernacle at Shiloh. Sometimes the word means tabernacles simply mean booths, and this was the feast where you actually built a little lean-to somewhere out under the sky and took your meals, and actually they were supposed to, as I understand it, sleep there, but today they just take their meals. So it's a remarkably happy and important feast called the Feast of Tabernacles, comes in the fall. So again, I'm going to say this, the Passover in the spring, Pentecost in the summer, and Tabernacles in the fall. But again, there were actually 7 distinguishable feasts because in cycling these 3 seasons. And I say here, and I don't want to spend any time, but there were other feasts like the Feast of Purim and the Feast of Hanukkah and so on that have developed in Israel's history. But these were the Levitically mandated feasts. Levitically means it was in the law, and 3 times a year, spring, summer, fall, Israel was to pretty much stop what it was doing and celebrate God's role in their life. That's what's at stake. Now, here they are. I've already given them to you, but given them to you, I'm going to move myself up here if I can. So you have, first of all, the springtime feast. Now, I'm going to go somewhere with this, but let me just lay it out real quickly. In the spring of the year, you had Passover. Now, along with Passover, here it is right here, came unleavened bread and first fruits. Obviously, above all other things, and I trust you understand this, but I'm going to say it very quickly, this feast remembers the Exodus, because the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn, and the only way for the firstborn in your family not to be slain was to be take a lamb, slay the lamb, and take the blood of the lamb, put it on the doorposts of the house you were in, and when the death angel saw that, he would pass over that house. So that's why it's called Passover. And that's its primarily, it is a memorial feast. It remembers, all right? On the other hand, it also, this is very important, celebrated the harvest of the early grain crops, and that's primarily, barley. It's primarily the barley crop, the oats and the feed and so on, animal feed. So here I give it to you again. The relationship to the agriculture, we're in the spring of the year. Remember that the spring of the year is the end of the grain growing season, the winter season. So you had the former rains last fall, and now you're waiting, and all through the winter you've been praying for rain, but now comes the harvest of the barley crops, and in connection with that, you remember the Exodus. Now, here's a curiosity, and it's worth thinking about, so I'm going to mention it earlier. I'm going to mention it quickly is what I'm trying to say. The fact is that God says in Exodus 12 that because of the importance of the Passover, this was going to be the beginning of months for you. Now, the Passover comes in a month called Nisan, and it's in the spring. And that's the beginning of the religious year. To this day, Israel's annual year, her political cycle, if you don't mind, begins, what happened here? Begins with Tishri, which comes in the fall, and that's the beginning of what's known as her civil year. So it becomes a bit confusing. As I said to you earlier, cultures tended to begin the year when the earth greened up, and that would be in Israel in the fall of the year. So their cycle began with the year, the first of the year comes in the fall. But God had said, but starting now, because of the importance of this feast, Passover happens in Nisan, and this is going to be the first of the month. So they have a religious year that begins in spring, and they have a civil year which begins in the fall, for what it's worth. All right, the other two feasts associated with Passover. The major feast is Passover, but the other two Levitical feasts are, first of all, unleavened bread, when they clear all the leaven out of the house as a symbol of God's purification, and then first fruits, which again seems to be probably the barley crop. And so you go out and you acknowledge that this crop is from God, and you wave it before God, and you express your desire that he would give a harvest as strong as these first fruits. And that's why Jesus is called the first fruit of those who are born from the dead. He's the harbinger. He's the prototype of the resurrection we're going to enjoy. The first fruits represent the coming crop as well. All right, so Passover comes in the springtime, and it is associated, I mean, to do that, with two other feasts, unleavened bread and first fruits. Then the summer feast stands alone, and it's called Pentecost, or 50, because it came 50 days after the Sabbath of the Passover cycle. So whenever the Passover happened, which is on Nisan 14, and that could be any day of the week. Now, there are various ways to understand this. This is the one that makes sense to me as I read it. But there are Passover come on any day of the week, but in the course of the Passover cycle of 7 days, there will be a Sabbath. And you take that Sabbath and start counting 50 days, 49 days, 7 weeks, 7 passages of 7 days, and that will always come out on a Saturday. And then, so you come out on a Saturday, and you start the day after the Sabbath, and then the next day after that is Pentecost. So it's 50 days after, but it's 7 sevens after. And it had to be after the latter rains, because this is when you celebrate the wheat harvest. I say the grain harvest here, but it's primarily the wheat. So now you've taken in the wheat harvest, and you stop and you acknowledge that God and God alone can give you the rain that you need for the grain harvest. So in the springtime, Passover celebrates the Exodus, but you also celebrate the first fruits of the barley harvest. And then in the summer, you have Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, and you celebrate the wheat harvest. And then in the autumn, in the fall, you have the high holy days. Now, this is the most important season of the year for the Jewish people religiously, and there are 3 feasts here. The big one is Tabernacles. We're going to talk about it. But first of all, there is the Feast of Trumpets. Now, the trumpets were born on the first day of the 7th month of the religious year. Curiously enough, this was the first day. This is the first month of the civil year. But again, as I said, this is the 7th month of the religious year. So on Tishri 1, the trumpets are blown. Let me talk about this for one quick minute. This is hugely important because Israel lived and lives to this day, but it's much more thoroughly computed by computers and so on. But Israel lived in antiquity by a lunar calendar. Now, there are not an even number of solar days in a lunar cycle, about 28 3/4. So you would count ahead 28 days, and then at the end of every month, the next month could start on one of 2 days. And the priests would go out in Jesus' day to a certain hill in Jerusalem, and they'd look into the star, and when it was dark enough that you could no longer see a thread, they would look up, and if they could see the moon, the sliver of the moon, what they call the new moon, which is just a little tiny crescent, if they could see that, then they said, all right, the new moon is here. We will start the next month tomorrow. If they didn't see the new moon, then they waited one more day, and that became the 29th of the former month. So the point is simply, and it may seem confusing, it worked out fine. They had a good system for it, but what it meant was that every month could start on one of 2 successive days. And by the way, it wasn't a function of simply whether the new moon was there, the sliver, because if it was a stormy, cloudy night, they couldn't see it, then they waited another day. Well, the importance is that Tabernacle begins on the 15th of Tishri. In order to calculate the 15th, you got to know when the first is. So there was a system by which they would go out. If they saw the moon, they would announce it, and they would immediately blow the trumpets, and the trumpets would be resounded. And there was a system of signifiers that went all the way to Persia and Babylon and into Africa and so on, by which it was announced that this was the first of the month. So that was the Feast of Trumpets. They would blow the trumpets to announce that which one of two successive days was the beginning of Tishri, so that they calculate the 15th of Tishri. Now, let me just say, I'll make one other note here that is kind of confusing. Today, the Feast of Trumpets is called Rosh Hashanah. And you won't see much of an allusion to the Feast of Trumpets in modern Jewish writings and liturgy. They call it Rosh Hashanah, which means the head of the year. It's New Year's. And it is, in fact, New Year's. And here's where that issue becomes difficult, because it is the civil New Year. But this is really part of the religious year. And this is supposed to be the 7th month in the religious year. And in point of fact, it was always the first month in the civil year. So for whatever reason, it's not very important. But today, you'll never hear about the Feast of Trumpets. It'll always be called Rosh Hashanah. And that's a function of the fact that this is, in fact, the first of Tishri that they're looking for is, in fact, the first day of the civil year. But having said that, they have the Feast of Trumpets. And then there is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And this is the single most important day. As a matter of fact, the days between trumpets and Yom Kippur are called the High Holy Days, or the Days of Awe. And we'll talk another time about how this has been, quite frankly, corrupted and distorted in modern Jewish thought and theology. But in that day, you had those 10 days just to prepare yourself. And on, of course, the Day of Atonement, the Yom Kippur, it means the Day of Atonement. And that was that one special, hugely important day when the high priest would go twice into the Holy of Holies and deposit the blood on the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant, that box in which the law was deposited, the tablets of Moses, and above it was the cherubim, and then the glory cloud, God, King Yahweh dwelling. And on that Day of Atonement, the sacrificial blood of an animal of God's choosing and provision. He actually chose the animal through the lots and so on. It was important. This goes all the way back to Genesis 3, when God made coats of skin for Adam and Eve. And I always say that those animals did not zip those skins off. There was a bloody death in order that God might provide a covering for nakedness and wickedness. And so you have that picture just goes throughout the Old Testament. It comes full almost in this day when the high priest would go in and deposit the blood on the mercy seat. The blood would be interposed between King Yahweh and the evidence of man's wickedness, the broken tables of the law. And thus the system would be atoned for, and man's sin would be covered and so on. So the Day of Atonement was a huge, huge important day. So Yom Kippur comes on the 10th of the 7th month. And then 5 days later is the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, called that Sukkot, because you would build a sukkah. Today it's called Sukkot, which is the plural of sukkah, and it simply means booths. Booths in the sense of tents or lean-tos, or because you would go out and you would build yourself a structure, and it had to be, it could be covered, but you had to be able to see the night sky through it, so you could have lattice work or reeds and so on. And you would take your meals and live out there, and it remembered the wilderness wanderings, but more important, it anticipated the Messianic kingdom. And by the way, in the Old Testament, when Messiah comes, every man will live under his vine and his fig tree. And so when in modernity, even today, when you can go down and buy one of these booths if you wish to for the season, but there will be little tendrils of vines and figs, and that's a picture of plenty and satisfaction and fruitfulness. So I say that just to make the point that you build a little booth, you live under there, you're anticipating the kingdom, but you are hugely celebrating the harvest of the summer crops, because all of those hillside crops, as we call them, the grapes and the olives and the figs and pomegranates, and even in some places, some of the orchard fruit and so on, all of those had been harvested at the end of the summer. And so now you're celebrating the ingathering of the hillside crops. So again, it's a time of great rejoicing, and the Jewish people love this feast above all others. And now, interestingly enough, at the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall of the year, we're making our way into the rainy season. So there's a great deal of focus in the liturgies and so on. You're praying for rain because this whole winter season, we're into the fall, now we're into the winter season. We need the rain to grow the crops. I always say we go to Israel quite often in the wintertime or the rainy time. And of course, we tourists are praying every night, God, give us good sunny weather tonight. And at every house in Israel, if there's a prayer being offered up, believe me, they're praying, please send us the rain. God has to sort that out. But that certainly plays into the marvelous story. John 7-9 all happens at the Feast of Tabernacles. It's explicit in 32 AD, and Jesus is there. And you remember he says, if any man thirst, let him come unto me, and out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. And I think it's very important that he was speaking that at a time when every Jewish mind was focused on the importance of water, and Jesus promises that. All right, so let me draw it together. This is, again, here's kind of you have the spring feast, which is Passover, unleavened bread, and then later in the year you have Pentecost here. You can just barely see it, but this Pentecost, that is in the summer, standing alone, celebrating the wheat harvest, Passover, the barley harvest. And then comes the fall feast with, first of all, trumpets, and then the Day of Atonement and tabernacles. So you have this regular cycle that never quits. So here's my point. The concept is that there are a lot of elements of the Mosaic Law designed to insinuate this Godward rhythm. And perhaps most important is this annual cycle of these 3 pilgrimage feasts with the other 4 attendant feasts. But the point is that the focus of that rhythm was King Yahweh. And I think it's so meaningful. Let me talk about this for just a moment to understand that this cycle of the calendar, God built the calendar, and he built in these 3 feasts, these 3 celebrations. And the climate is such that you got the winter growing season for the grain, the summer for the hillside crops. And so every one of those feasts is related to the agricultural cycle. And the point is that God wants you to be reminded and wants you to stop and think about this, that only God can give you the rain which is necessary for grain, and therefore only God can give you life. Your life hangs on God's goodness year in and year out. But there's more to it than that. If the grain crops grown in the summer and harvested in the spring, if the grain crops, barley, wheat, hay, and so on, if those crops grown in the winter and harvested in the spring and summer are necessary for life, the hillside crops are necessary to enjoy life, because almost everything that is really delightful in Jewish life, in antiquity especially, was a function of those hillside crops. The grapes gave you sweetness, and they used grapes in every conceivable way in their diet. They not only ate them and crushed them, but it was part of almost every recipe. Most of the sweetness in their diet came from grapes. Olive, they used them for medicine. They used them for mollifying wounds. They used them for cosmetics. They used them for baking. The olive oil was sold for light. If you had a bad olive crop, you're going to be stubbing your toe all winter long, because all of those little oil lamps were olive oil. So again, I repeat, the scents, SCENT, and so on. So much of that was a function of these hillside crops. So the winter crops, you need to live. The summer crops, you need to enjoy living. And only God can give you those crops, Deuteronomy 11. So 3 times a year, Israel stops pretty much everything they're doing, and they concentrate on these realities, that only God can give us life, and only God can give us the capacity to enjoy life. God knows that we have this alarming tendency to forget, and this even perhaps more alarming tendency to rebel. And so he just built into their life this remarkable series of celebrations, feasts, where you would focus on God. Let me say this about that too, that to this day they keep these feasts. But they don't necessarily remember Yahweh, and when they do, they rather deliberately misremember Yahweh. And I want to go back to Passover, not Passover, to Tabernacle, to the Day of Atonement. Because this is what's done today. This is the way the Day of Atonement is understood. They celebrate Rosh Hashanah on the 1st of Tishri. And then the Day of Atonement comes on the 10th of Tishri. But during those 10 intervening days, which they call the days of awe, well, they teach that on the Rosh Hashanah, the 1st of Tishri, which in the Bible is trumpets today, that the name of every human being on earth is written in one of two books, the book of life or the book of death. And what that means is, if your name is written in the book of life, you are going to live through this calendar year. But if your name is written in the book of death, you're going to die sometime this year. You don't know which book your name is written in. But in point of fact, you have 10 days, those 10 days of awe between the Feast of Trumpets and the Feast of Atonement. You have 10 days to change God's mind. If, in fact, he wrote your name in the book of death, then you have 10 days to do enough good deeds, alms, prayers, repentance, restoring relationship, honesty. You have 10 days to talk God into taking your name out of the book of life and sealing it, S-E-A-L, in the book of life. Did I say the book? Take your name out of the book of death and put it in the book of life. And the greeting all throughout Jewry at this time is happy sealing, S-E-A-L, and may your name be inscribed, sealed in the book of life. And so they've taken this marvelous, marvelous Day of Atonement that was built to teach you that there is a holy God who is offended by your sin, and the only hope you have is the interposition of the blood of a sacrificial victim whom God will provide and who can die the death you deserve to die if you'll but depend upon him. All of that beautiful picture has been horribly, horribly metastasized into this idea that God may very well have decreed that you die this year, and if you do enough good deeds, you may be able to talk him out of it. And I always think it's a horrible tragedy, but I go back to it. God's intent was that these 3 seasons of the year be an opportunity to focus in on God and acknowledge that only he can give you life and only he can give you the capacity to enjoy life. Now, I'm going to be very quick with this final one. The struggle for the soil and the soul of Israel. And what I mean by it is simply this, that because God made this people, the family of Abraham, the nation of Israel, to be the one people on earth with whom he made covenant relationship, and the one people on earth who would bear his name before an unbelieving world. A world that deeply, desperately despises that God. And so because Israel was that nation whom God would use to put himself on display and reveal himself to an unbelieving, hateful world, Israel has been deeply hated. And she has had to struggle for her soil. That is, there is always a people who want to push Israel into the sea. They want to wipe them off the face of the earth at every stage of history. And I do not believe for a moment that you can make any sort of sense of the kind of rabid, insane, unbalanced, irrational inability of the world to deal honestly with Israel. The fact that today, in most of the minds of the people, the minds of most of the people of this country, there is no moral difference between Israel's determination to protect her children and her enemy's determination to slaughter her children. And when somebody sets out to slaughter Israelis, that's wrong. And if Israel does something to protect her children, that's just as wrong. That is moral insanity. There's no making sense of it unless you factor in this spiritual dynamic, that because Israel is haltingly, reluctantly, ineffectually, but inevitably, inexorably, because Israel is the people of King Yahweh, the people of Yahweh, the one nation on earth whom God has chosen to represent himself before an unbelieving world. They're going to be hated, and there's going to be every effort made to wipe them off the face of the earth. They're going to have to struggle just to survive their soil. But there's another dynamic, and that is this: because it is so difficult to live out this covenant relationship before a hating, unbelieving world, there's always been the tendency within the Jewish world itself, maybe we ought to blend in. Maybe we ought to try and fit in. Remember, God made them to be, we're right back where we started. Because they are a kingdom of priests, they're representing God, they're going to be hated. Because they are a holy nation, that is, God in so many ways, and I'd love to talk more about this, but in so many ways, through the law and their history, and God has made them a distinct people, but they don't want to be distinct. They want to fit in. And so there's always been the tendency, well, maybe we ought to just assimilate. Maybe we ought to try and blend in with all things Gentile, and people won't notice. But there's always been a counter attitude in the Jewish world that says, no, we are the people of God. We are going to maintain our allegiance to Yahweh no matter cost. And so there's this struggle for the soul of Israel. Who is going to define who Israel is? This is the Pharisee versus the Sadducee. Sadducees saying, let's just blend in, burn a little incense to some Greek gods. Maybe they won't trouble us. Pharisees saying, no, we are the people of God. We are going to be purists. We're going to be loyal to the law, no matter what it costs us. And this is the vision that rips Israel, Jewish life in two today. The greatest conflict in Jewish life today is not Arab versus Jew. It's religious Jew versus secular Jew. The secular Jew saying, let's just blend in. Let's just get along, be one of the nations. The religious Jews saying, no, we are going to be loyal. So Israel's history has been so much characterized by this struggle between and these two counts for the soil of Israel. That is, his enemy wants him to cast him into the sea, and the soul of Israel within Israel itself, this division. So there we have it. God's intent was always that Israel be a light to the nation. To that end, he shaped the earth, the continent, so that they could be a kingdom with a priestly function, and the nations of the world would be passing through there and carrying the stories. But he also shaped the little land so that they could be a holy nation with these divisions. They could live in the mountains. He gave them this law system which would set them apart, and the nations would be in awe of the wisdom of that law. But then he knew that he was going to have to discipline them. So you have this regular rainfall, but it runs off quickly. And God says, if you don't obey me, I won't send a former and latter rains. You need it year by year. But then he wanted to remind them to keep ever before their mind and soul spirit this reality that they are a people of God, much blessed. So you have this calendar with its 3 feasts and these 2 growing seasons, and each of the crops is celebrated, acknowledging that God and God alone can give you life, and God alone can give you the ability to enjoy life. But out of all that comes this struggle for the soil, because they are so much hated as the people of God, and struggle for the soul, because there is this constant tendency to maybe abandon that standing. Again, a construct, a sort of set of ideas that I want us to be able to think in terms of this in all that we do in Israel.